as we noted at the end of the last video, the NAACP and Kenneth Clark and his wife were able to put together enough evidence to convince the Supreme Court to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson or the separate but equal doctrine. And they were basically able to do that using the Dahl test. Now what happens is the Supreme Court, by a unanimous decision in 1954, 9-0, they decide that the separate but equal doctrine should be overturned. And what happens is this case, which dealt with segregated schools, starts a process where segregation in all aspects of society is now going to be determined unconstitutional. Because if you remember back to Plessy versus Ferguson, that court case dealt with a man on a train being racially segregated. And they said racial segregation on the trains was fine, and that led to basically the court saying racial segregation in any environment would be fine. Well, in this case, Brown versus Board of Education, that process was reversed. Courts specifically say in this case that racially segregated schools cause harm. And from that point forward, we start to see a movement throughout society where we start saying if racially segregated schools are wrong, racially segregated movie theaters are wrong, and racially segregated restaurants are wrong, and racially segregated buses are wrong. So this decision was a very, very pivotal decision in moving forward, not only in the African American civil rights movement, but in civil rights movements for many other groups. And if you remember me saying at the beginning of this chapter, when the African Americans are successful in winning this battle to end de jure segregation, they use the courts to do it. And once the Supreme Court says in 1954 that we have to end racial segregation, within several years we start to see pieces of legislation passed by the Congress that starts to attack other aspects of civil rights. So the African Americans start off in the courts, and their fight eventually makes it to Congress and the state legislatures. Since they're successful in fighting for their civil rights in this way, you will find that when women fight for their civil rights, they attempt it the same way. When Hispanics fight for their civil rights, they do it the same way. When the disabled do it, and I have a prediction that if and when the Supreme Court has a favorable ruling for homosexuals, then you will see this fight for homosexual equality or equal rights for homosexuals. You'll see it move from the courts into the legislatures. So this success by the African Americans, this method of using the courts, was copied or emulated by many other groups after them that fought for their civil rights. Now, we have this Brown versus Board of Education decision, and a lot of times we oversimplify the civil rights battle, and we simply say that when the Supreme Court says racial segregation or de jure discrimination is illegal, everything becomes fine. 1954, the Supreme Court says integrate the schools. And a lot of people just assume that starting in 1955, all these schools are integrated. And that's not the case. There continue to be issues relating to racially segregated schools up into the 60s and 70s. And the primary reason that we have this issue is, first of all, the Supreme Court was not real specific in their 1954 ruling. They just simply said, segregate your schools. Well, by 1955, we were seeing that a lot of the specifically southern schools were not integrating. So there was a case known as Brown versus Board of Education 2, where this case is brought back to the Supreme Court, and in 1955, the Supreme Court says, okay, now I'm not only telling you have to segregate the schools, but we're telling you have to segregate the schools with all due haste. And basically what that means is as fast as you can. But we continue to have a problem, because if I was to take two students and look them in the eye and say, I want you to get this essay done as fast as you can means 3 hours to one student, and maybe it means 3 days to another. So the Supreme Court still wasn't very clear on when this had to happen. And basically what happens is the federal government has to get very involved in the process of desegregating these schools. The federal government has to get involved in an issue that had traditionally been a state issue, education. So this process is a relatively long, drawn-out process because of the fact that we had a federal form of government. The states still have a lot of authority over education, but now the federal government has some influence. So it takes a long time before the states fully embrace this idea of integration of the schools. What we need to realize is what we're saying here is that de jure discrimination is gone. When we say Brown versus Board of Education outlawed segregation in the schools, that's true. But Brown versus Board of Education simply said that the government can no longer discriminate. The problem we run into, though, is that we have another type of discrimination that exists in the world besides de jure. There's a second type of discrimination that we see, and that is called de facto discrimination. De facto discrimination is a situation where discrimination or segregation happens based on the decisions of private individuals or factors that the government cannot easily control or impact. When we look at de jure discrimination in the schools or de jure segregation in the schools, it was very obvious why there was segregated schools in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. That was because there was a law passed that said there will be segregated schools. African Americans and whites can't go to school together. And it's relatively easy to overcome that de jure discrimination. You simply pass a new law saying segregated schools are illegal. De jure discrimination you can eliminate by passing a law, because when you pass a law, you can change people's actions. But the problem is that when you pass a law, you can't change people's beliefs. And when we pass Brown versus Board of Education, and we start saying, now we're going to integrate our schools, there were some people who still said, I don't believe in integrated schools, and I'm going to do something that's going to prevent my child from having to go to school with an African American. Maybe they'll move to an area where there are no African Americans. Maybe they'll put their child in a private school. Maybe they will homeschool their child. We have segregated schools today in a lot of areas, and part of it's because people choose to live in one neighborhood over another. Can the government tell me where I can and cannot live? No, they cannot. Can the government tell me I can't send my children to a private school, an all-white private school? No, they cannot. So a lot of the segregation that we see in today's schools is based on what we call de facto issues that the government cannot very easily change. It's very easy to change people's actions by changing the law, but it's very difficult to change people's beliefs. And I'll give you a real quick personal example. My mom and dad were very different people. When my mom and dad got married, my mom was a very, very liberal individual. My dad is a very conservative individual. And when my mom and dad got married, my mom told my father that, you know, I'm a liberal person. I have gay friends. I have Hispanic friends. I have black friends. I have Jewish friends. I have lots of different friends. And those people are going to come into our home. And I expect you to treat them with respect. And my father said, yes, ma'am. My mom was the law in the house. Well, in 1995, my mother passed away. The law was no longer there to tell my dad to change the way you act. And in early 2000, when we put my dad in the nursing home, I would go visit my dad in the nursing home. And within 5 minutes of being in his room with him, he very clearly told me who had helped him get dressed, or who had done this to him, or who had done that to him during the day. And my dad reverted back to his old ways. He would not say, oh, it was that very nice black lady that helped me, or it was that Hispanic lady. My dad's bigotry and my dad's racial discrimination came back out. Because what happened was when my mom was alive, she set the law. And my dad had to follow it, so he changed his behavior. But when the law was gone, when my mom was gone, he went back to his old ways. Same thing happens in this country. The government tells us we can't discriminate at work. But when we get home, we discriminate. We tell our kids, I don't want you hanging out with that guy, or we don't want you doing this, or we don't want you doing that, because the government cannot control those things. That is what today's civil rights battle is about. It's about overcoming de facto issues. The Supreme Court has been pretty clear to say that de jure discrimination is illegal. We're going to take a look at some examples of where segregation continues, not because the government says it's illegal to discriminate, but where segregation continues because of de facto issues. Let me give you a real quick example of de facto discrimination or de facto segregation. Today, when the research is done, we will find that many of today's schools are just as racially segregated as they were before the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And when we think about that, how can that be? The Supreme Court very clearly said in Brown versus Board of Education, segregated schools are illegal. But the problem is that today's racially segregated schools are, for the most part, are based on things like individual choice and other societal factors that government cannot control. In other words, it's based on de facto discrimination or de facto segregation. Just because the government can't absolutely eliminate a de facto issue like individual choice or economic status doesn't mean the government hasn't tried. And let me give you an example. Let's take a look at a map of New York, okay? When we look at New York, you'll see that many of the inner city schools are predominantly African American or predominantly people of color. What happened was the states and the federal government started these things called busing programs. And what would happen is the government would try to end these segregated schools by busing minority students from the inner city to the suburbs, and then we would bus Caucasian students from the suburbs into the inner city to try and balance out the racial makeup of each school. But when the government did that, what happened was the parents of the suburban students, many of which did not want their children going to school with African Americans, could afford to send their students either to private schools, or the families could afford to move further out on Long Island where there were less African Americans. Basically what you have is these parents making an individual choice to leave the suburbs that used to be predominantly white to other areas further out on Long Island that were predominantly white. The African Americans could not afford to follow them because African Americans at the time and today have less economic strength than the white majority does. And the whites were moving so far out on Long Island, so far from the inner city schools, that you could not have these African American and minority students on the bus for 3 hours to get to school and 3 hours back. So what happens is the suburban schools start to become mostly African American, and the schools that are further out on Long Island become more and more white. The government can't overcome that. And this was a real phenomenon. This really happened, and it was called white flight. The white citizens did not want to have their children go to school with African Americans, so since they had the ability, they could move away from it. What can the government do about that? Nothing. And this has gone on for years. It has just been within the past couple of years where this concept of busing has really been eliminated, because we realized that we can continue to bus students further and further from their homes to try and make these schools more integrated. But people who are really determined not to go to school with a certain group of people, if they have the economic ability, they're going to be able to get around it. We obviously know that the government should not or cannot force those parents of the white students to stay in the suburbs. So what do? Do we now, that since it's shown that busing has not been successful in ending segregated schools, should the government simply give up No, the government has not just simply given up on it. They have tried to come up with new ways. And let me give you another way that the government has tried to overcome this new round of racial segregation that we have that's based on de facto issues. When we look at our schools in this country, we have used programs like busing, we've used vouchers or school choice, and we've also tried something called community-based schools. And community-based schools are an idea that the government is trying, or that communities are trying, that is not nearly as controversial as vouchers, and they believe will be more successful than the idea of busing. And the way community-based schools work is this way. When we look at our schools in this country, most of our schools are neighborhood-based, which means you go to the school that's closest to where you live. And this map of Cape Girardeau that I've gotten, I've made up some statistics on here. You see this group at the upper left-hand part of the map. Let's say that's where most of the white students live. And then the location at the lower left-hand part of Cape Girardeau County, that's where most of the Asian students. The way it works with neighborhood-based schools is there would be a school up in the white neighborhood that all the white students would go to. And then there would be another school down in the Asian neighborhood where most of the Asians would go to school. Now, instead of busing the white students to the Asian neighborhood and the Asian students to the white neighborhood, community-based schools say, we need to stop this by creating a centralized school. Instead of having an elementary school in the white neighborhood and an elementary school in the Asian neighborhood, you create a larger centrally located school in the middle of Cape Girardeau County. So everybody in Cape Girardeau County would go to the same school. Then you would have people from all races that live in Cape Girardeau County going to the same school. It's not going to answer all of the problems, because if you do that, there are going to be some people that move out of Cape Girardeau County if they can afford to do that. Or there are going to be some people who send their kids to private schools. By having this centrally located school, though, this community-based school instead of the neighborhood-based school, you have more integration. There are ways to try to overcome these de facto issues, but none of them are perfect. But the question we have to answer is, just because we cannot completely eliminate and de facto segregation, should we not try at all? Should the government just throw their hands up and just say, you know, people are going to live where they want to, people are going to act the way they want, and just let it go? I think that's where our argument in the civil rights battle today is. We have stopped talking so much about the fact that we should guarantee equal opportunity to everybody. And we've started talking more about the idea that we have to try and figure out how to ensure equal outcomes to everyone. The reason that today's civil rights battle is so much more complicated and so much more difficult is because we have shifted from this fight for equal opportunity to now a fight to try and guarantee equal outcomes. And the problem is, with this shift, is when we look at how each of those are achieved. How do you achieve equal opportunity? How do you achieve equal outcomes? That's the first problem. And the second problem is, can we guarantee equal opportunity? And can we guarantee equal outcomes or equal results? There's a very, very difficult battle that's going on today. When we look at the two concepts, we need to realize that opportunity can be given. The government can give somebody the opportunity to do something. And usually that's by passing a law. African Americans were not able to vote for years in this country because there were laws preventing them from doing it. But in the 1960s, we gave African Americans the opportunity to vote. We passed laws saying African Americans are allowed to vote. But it was still years before African Americans started voting in large numbers. Because you can give somebody the opportunity to do things and them not take advantage of it. The government has tried and done a pretty good job at providing certain opportunities to minority groups. Pell Grants. It's an opportunity to allow all individuals, including minorities, to go to school. Affirmative action plans are opportunities or laws that were passed by the government to try and give some of the racial minorities and women the opportunity to catch up. 1965 Voting Rights Act was, again, a law that passed that said now African Americans have the right to vote, the opportunity to vote. But the problem is, if I'm a white person or an African American person or a female or a disabled person who doesn't want to take advantage of that opportunity and go to school, then I'm not going to have the same outcome as somebody who's white or somebody who takes advantage of that opportunity. Outcomes must be achieved by individuals. The government cannot guarantee outcomes because outcomes are so many times internally driven. The government cannot motivate a person to do what's needed to have a positive outcome. The government cannot overcome all the obstacles a person has. The government cannot give everybody the same ability. If I just don't want to go to school, the government can't motivate me to do what's necessary to go to school, let alone be successful in school. If I happen to be in a situation where my husband died and I've got 4 children, I'm a single mom with 4 children or a single dad with 4 children, the government can't help me overcome all of those obstacles that are involved in being a single parent with 4 children. We can do our best to try, but there's no way in our society you can guarantee that you can help that family that has those obstacles overcome every one of those obstacles. There'll be some people who just can't do it. And then there are some people who just don't have the same mental capacity as other people. So while we can say to individuals in this country, you all have the opportunity to go to college, not everybody that goes to college is going to be successful, and not everybody's going to try and go to college. Today's civil rights battle is dealing with the hard issue. Easy part was providing equal opportunity. The hard part is trying to equalize the outcomes. Do we want equalized outcomes? That's the argument that we're having here. Do we want 100% of all young people to graduate from college? We'd definitely love more young people to graduate from college. But there's no way we can guarantee that 100% of all young people will graduate from college because there are different factors. There are individual choices. There are individual abilities that affect whether or not I graduate from college. So today's civil rights battle is a battle over whether we want equal outcomes and how much should we be doing to try and equalize those outcomes. Most people would probably agree that there's no way that you could have equal outcomes in all aspects of life. Education, for example. Can I guarantee that every student, white, black, Asian, female, male, graduate from Southeast Missouri State University? Could I equalize outcomes? Absolutely I could. I could simply say, any student that comes to Southeast Missouri State University and attends for 4 years, I'm going to give them a degree. If we did that, what good would that degree do? Then it would just be a piece of paper that really didn't mean a lot. But we'd even have problems there because if I said all you have to do is come to class every day for 4 years and you're going to get a degree, there are going to be some people who just choose not to come to class. Today's civil rights battle is so much more difficult to deal with than it was in the past because in the past we were dealing with de jure discrimination, and it's very easy to end de jure discrimination by passing a law. It's difficult to equalize outcomes because there are so many de facto issues that are involved. Our government has very clearly said we should try and equalize outcomes, get as close to equalizing outcomes as possible. But we need to realize that it's not possible to truly 100% make every race, every gender, every type of group in this country have equal outcomes.